Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with a very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. We're stepping into a time when people feared bathing more than plague, when garlic could double as perfume, and when your neighbor might literally throw strange things out the window and call it normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Cleanliness is next to godliness, said absolutely no one in the 14th century. Let's begin with a surprising fact. In the early Middle Ages, bathing was actually considered a good thing. Monasteries had bathhouses, and Roman traditions of soaking and scrubbing still lingered in some corners of Europe. But over time, particularly by the late medieval period, the idea of bathing shifted from healthy to hazardous. So what changed? In short, fear, superstition, and a wildly incorrect understanding of how the human body worked. People believed that hot water opened the pores, which they thought allowed illness to seep in. Imagine bathing during a plague outbreak and thinking, I've just turned myself into a sponge for death. That was the mindset. Bathing too often, they feared, could weaken your body and even invite disease. Water, in this worldview, wasn't cleansing, it was treacherous. It didn't help that bathhouses became morally suspicious. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many public bathhouses, once places of hygiene and even community, became social hubs with a rather scandalous reputation. Some operated like spas, others like brothels. Eventually, church leaders began to associate bathing with sin, which in medieval Europe was an excellent way to get things shut down. So instead of scrubbing down, many medieval folks just stopped bathing altogether. Not because they loved being dirty, but because staying dry was seen as safer, holier, and frankly more modest. After all, being naked was one thing. Being naked in hot water? That was practically inviting the devil in for a splash. This doesn't mean everyone wandered around like a mud-covered goblin. People still cleaned themselves in bits and pieces, washing hands, faces, and feet with cloths and herbal rinses. But the full body soak became rare, reserved for the very wealthy, the dangerously brave, or the terminally itchy. So yes, medieval people feared bathing, but not because they were lazy or ignorant. They were trying, in their own 14th century way, to stay healthy. Unfortunately, without germ theory, indoor plumbing, or a basic grasp of microbiology, the strategy was more paranoia than prevention. Once upon a time in a town that didn't yet smell like horse manure and regret, the public bathhouse was a hub of hygiene, health, and mildly inappropriate social interaction. Inspired by lingering Roman influence, early medieval bathhouses offered warm water, communal tubs, and a hint of optimism. These were places where townsfolk could soak, steam, and chat like a medieval spa day, minus the cucumbers and scented candles. Monks, merchants, and even lower nobles used them. Cleanliness, for a brief moment in time, was both possible and fashionable. Then things got steamy in the worst way. By the 13th century, bathhouses had acquired a reputation for, let's say, multitasking. Bathing became less about cleanliness and more about companionship. Some bathhouses began offering extra services, with attendants who were suspiciously friendly and water that had seen far too many strangers. The line between wellness and wantonness blurred fast. It didn't take long for the church to get involved. Public nudity, even when paired with a loofah, was frowned upon. Sexual misconduct? Even worse. Bathhouses became synonymous with sin, disease, and scandal. And once the Black Death rolled into town, people were more than happy to shut them down permanently. After all, you can't spread plague through a public tub if the tub has been boarded shut and declared morally compromised. But it wasn't just sin and sickness that doomed the bathhouse. It was suspicion. Over time, bathing itself began to seem indulgent, even dangerous. The very idea of soaking your body in warm water, especially with strangers, felt like a gateway to both physical and spiritual ruin. And so one by one, the bathhouses closed. Some were turned into bakeries. Others were simply abandoned and left to rot a poetic fate, really, for buildings meant to keep people clean. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks quietly lamented the loss. Many had maintained hygienic practices for centuries, including scheduled bathing. But now even that was in question. The church wasn't banning hygiene outright, just making it incredibly difficult to achieve. Thus began the golden age of dry cleaning, medieval style. Soap became optional. Water became suspicious. And the bathhouse? Just another relic of a time when scrubbing didn't come with consequences. Despite the church's growing horror at naked elbows and the widespread belief that a hot bath could let the plague in through your pores, medieval people didn't completely abandon the idea of bathing. They just turned it into something you do once a season, or when the smell became sentient. Let's begin with the nobles. Yes, wealthy people bathed, though not so often that their rubber ducks got wrinkly. They had servants lug in cauldrons of boiling water, because indoor plumbing was still centuries away. Pour it into a large wooden tub, lined with a linen sheet, and sprinkle it with herbs like lavender, sage, or whatever was growing nearby that didn't smell like feet. This wasn't so much a bath as it was a soup you sat in. The bath was often prepared in the bedroom or near a fireplace. Privacy was optional, depending on your level of power or shamelessness. Some even shared the tub with their spouse, because what's more romantic than floating in each other's filth like medieval fondue? The poor bathed too, but usually in rivers, barrels, or anything that held water and didn't bite. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about efficiency. Might as well wash the kid, the shirt, and the goat all at once. Was probably said more than once. In winter, bathing took a back seat to survival. So instead of soap and water, people turned to a strategy known as pretend you're clean and just keep walking. A few urban bathhouses survived, particularly in southern Europe, where warmer weather and better plumbing kept the dream of cleanliness alive. These were sometimes well run, with steam rooms and herbal treatments. Other times, they doubled as venues for extracurricular activities not approved by the Vatican. Either way, you left refreshed, mildly steamed, and possibly slightly judged. For special occasions like childbirth or plague recovery, people would get proper baths, because nothing says, "Welcome to the world," or "Please don't die," like being dipped in a barrel of tepid rosemary water. When full-body immersion became suspect, thanks to the belief that hot water invited disease like an open bar, the medieval world turned to the next best thing, the humble sponge bath. Except they didn't really have sponges, at least not the soft, mass-produced kind you can buy at any modern store. Instead, they used linen cloths soaked in warm water, herbs, or vinegar, and wiped themselves down like they were trying to buff a stain off a very delicate chair. Hygiene in this context meant dabbing. If you were lucky, someone else did it for you. If you were noble, someone else did it reluctantly. These partial washes focused on hands, face, armpits, and occasionally the feet, the high-traffic areas, so to speak. Under layers of clothing, particularly linen shirts and shifts, helped absorb sweat and grime, meaning that changing your shirt regularly was about as close to modern hygiene as you were going to get. Your tunic may have been crusty, but your undershirt? Fresh, of course. Nobody was fooling themselves into thinking this was proper cleaning. But if water was limited, or if you believed a proper bath might invite the Black Death, this was the safe bet. And in a world without deodorant, toothpaste, or showers, a cloth soaked in rose water or vinegar was the medieval equivalent of a spa day minus the spa, and really, minus the day. For wealthier folks, attendants might heat water, Mix in herbs like rosemary or marjoram, and gently wash their master or mistress while pretending not to judge them. Peasants would boil water over a fire, then ladle it out into bowls and do the same perhaps without the subtle judgment, but definitely with more draft. And if you were a monk, you probably had a better routine than most. Many monastic orders required scheduled washing, even if it was more spiritual than sanitary. Either way, the result was the same: a quick rub down, a whisper of moisture, and a renewed sense of being just clean enough to not scare the livestock. So no, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked, more or less. At least until you had to ride a horse for 6 hours through mud. If medieval hair had a motto, it would probably be flammable. But fragrant. Contrary to popular belief, people didn't walk around with matted bird nests on their heads, at least not intentionally. They did, in fact, wash their hair, just not frequently, and certainly not with anything resembling shampoo. So what did they use? A variety of homebrewed concoctions that sounded like the first draft of a spell book. One popular choice was lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, which was great for cutting through grease, and also your scalp if used too often. Pair that with water of dubious quality, and you've got yourself a medieval chemical peel. For those hoping to preserve their follicles a little longer, egg yolks were sometimes used as a gentler cleanser. And yes, that meant sitting in a freezing hut with raw eggs sliding down your neck while trying to convince yourself this was nourishing. Others rinsed with beer, which, if nothing else, made you smell like you'd had a wild night, even if you were just trying to remove lice. Some hair washing recipes included vinegar infusions with rosemary or lavender, which did double duty. They covered up other smells and gave the illusion of care. But let's be clear, no one was lathering up and rinsing twice. This was more of a targeted splash and squeeze operation. Water temperature also mattered. Hot water was believed to weaken the brain, while cold water could give you the plague. Lukewarm was the sweet spot, assuming you had fuel to heat it, and didn't mind waiting 3 hours for a bucket of bath water that your sibling hadn't already used. Brushing, on the other hand, was routine. Combs made of bone, wood, or horn were common, and often elaborately carved. A rare moment of elegance in an otherwise itchy reality. And people took pride in long, well-kept hair. Noble women in particular might spend hours getting their hair braided, coiled, and veiled, all while hoping a nearby fireplace didn't undo their hard work with one rogue spark. Dental care in medieval Europe was less sparkling smile, and more, I still have most of my teeth. What is your excuse? Now, to their credit, medieval people didn't entirely ignore oral hygiene. They didn't exactly understand it either, but they made a solid effort using what they had, which was mostly cloth, charcoal, and blind hope. There were no toothbrushes. That innovation was still centuries away. Instead, people used linen rags to rub their teeth clean, ideally soaked in something abrasive like salt, crushed mint, or even burnt rosemary ash. The goal wasn't whitening, it was survival. If your breath didn't knock someone over, you were already winning. Some opted for chewing stick-thin twigs from trees like hazel or elm, frayed at one end to create a brush-like effect. You chewed until the fibers separated, then scrubbed your teeth. Think of it as the original biodegradable toothbrush, organic, compostable, and weirdly bark-flavored. To freshen breath, people chewed fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, depending on what they could afford or what they could sneak from the spice rack. In wealthier circles, you might rinse your mouth with vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water, because nothing says dental sophistication like gargling a fluid also used to embalm pharaohs. And if you're wondering about toothpaste, it did sort of exist. Some recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash mixed with honey or oil to form a gritty paste. If your mouth didn't feel cleaner afterward, it at least felt sandblasted. Now dentists, if you could call them, that were usually barbers on their off days. If a tooth was loose, infected, or just annoying, the solution was simple. Yank it out. No anesthetic, no questions, just a wooden chair, a strong grip, and a few words to God. Aftercare included rinsing with wine and hoping your soul left your body before the infection set in. Despite all this, medieval people weren't necessarily toothless. Diets were lower in processed sugar, and many rural folks had better dental health than modern snackers. But when rot did set in, it set in fast, and the only toothpaste strong enough to fix it was divine intervention. Let's be honest, if you time traveled to a bustling medieval town square, your first reaction wouldn't be awe. It would be gagging, because medieval Europe smelled ... committed to being unforgettable. There was no sewage system, no deodorant, and very few functioning bathtubs, which meant the average street smelled like a combination of sweat, animals, rotting food, and optimism. If your nose survived a trip through the fish market and passed the tanner's shop, congratulations. You'd already done better than most tourists. So how did people deal with this olfactory chaos? They got creative. Enter the pomander, a small hollow ball filled with herbs and spices, worn around the neck or tucked into clothing like a medieval Glade plug-in. These were stuffed with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, or musk, and often dipped in ambergris, whale barf but fancy, to make them smell pleasant. Think of it as carrying around your own portable air filter, only it didn't purify anything, just politely overpowered the filth. Ladies often wore scented sachets in their bodices, both to mask their own body odor and to ward off the smell of others. Some even braided herbs, like rosemary or marjoram, directly into their hair. It was equal parts hygiene, fashion, and spiritual pest control. For those with coin, perfume was imported from the Middle East or Italy, made from rose oil or civet, extracted from the rear end of a very surprised cat-like animal. Applying it involved dabbing, waving, and pretending you weren't just covering up the stench of boiled turnips and regret. And then there were the environmental smells. Open sewers, livestock, candle smoke, and whatever the local butcher had just flung into the street. Cities were often enveloped in a fog of funk, but no one really complained, because everyone was in the same nasal nightmare together. It was communal suffering with notes of garlic. The church encouraged spiritual cleanliness, but physical scent was left largely to chance. If you smelled decent, people assumed you were rich or saintly. If you didn't, you were just blending in. If you've ever forgotten to wear deodorant and spent the day nervously checking your armpits like a suspicious criminal, imagine doing that for your entire life. Except no one had deodorant, and everyone smelled like they'd been jousting in wool for 3 days straight. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where body odor wasn't just a possibility, it was an identity. There were no roll-ons, no sprays, and certainly no clinical strength aluminum-based antiperspirants. People simply sweated and then made peace with it. Sort of. To mask or manage the musk, people employed various tricks. One common method was alum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt that has mild antibacterial and astringent properties. It didn't stop sweat, but it could cut down on the stench, assuming you remembered to apply it and didn't mind grinding rocks into your pits. Others used chalk, vinegar rinses, or crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular, not because they were effective, but because they smelled like something better than you. The logic was simple. If you can't stop the sweat, at least try to smell like a salad. In fact, perfumed handkerchiefs were all the rage among nobles, mostly so they could hold them under their noses while navigating crowded streets. No one wants to smell like medieval stew meat, but everyone did. The best you could do was smell like floral stew meat. Medieval medicine also played its part, unfortunately. Physicians believed sweating was a healthy way to purge bad humors, so blocking it was seen as suspicious, possibly even dangerous. You were expected to sweat, stink, and let the body cleanse itself. You weren't unclean, you were just medically fragrant. Then there was the fashion problem. Layers upon layers of wool, linen, and fur trapped heat and moisture like a mobile greenhouse. Combine that with open fires, feasting, and the occasional plague, and you had yourself a sensory experience worthy of a full-blown evacuation. But hey, you weren't alone. Everyone around you smelled. Even the king. Even the priests. Even the woman selling you radishes who hasn't bathed since Epiphany. In short, deodorant wasn't real, but shared suffering absolutely was. In a world without showers, soaps that didn't maim, or deodorant that didn't involve herbs stuffed into your armpit, medieval people turned to an unlikely hero in their hygiene routine. Linen, not to eat off of, but to wear, preferably close to the body, and changed before it grew legs. Linen undergarments were the unsung saviors of the Middle Ages. Breathable, absorbent, and surprisingly durable, they were worn beneath the heavier, more unwashable layers of wool and fur. Linen shirts, schmezzes, and shifts soaked up the sweat, grime, and everything else the body enthusiastically produced in a world that celebrated moisture but misunderstood soap. The logic was elegant: wash the linen, not the person, because scrubbing your own body was risky. See, the plague, but scrubbing your shirt, perfectly safe. People might go weeks without bathing, but they would change their underlayer, sometimes even twice a week, which by medieval standards was practically saintly. Linen was so respected that it became a status signal. If your shirt was white and relatively clean, people assumed you had your life together. If it was gray, crusty, and sprouting mold well, you were either poor, possessed, or recently resurrected. For women, the linen shift was essential. It protected outer garments from sweat, and perhaps more importantly, from the smell of sweat. It was the medieval version of Febreze, only less chemical, and far more judgmental, if not maintained. Knights wore linen under their armor to avoid turning into baked ham during tournaments. Monks wore it under their habits. Even peasants wore linen tunics, though usually patched, threadbare, and held together by sheer willpower. Of course, washing linen wasn't fun. It involved boiling water, lye, beating the fabric on rocks, and hoping the river didn't sweep it away. But it was still easier than bathing yourself, or dealing with the spiritual consequences of baring your chest to a tub of warm water. If there was one thing truly consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, it was itching. Not because people were allergic to linen or hay, but because they were constantly playing host to an entire traveling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. Lice were such an everyday nuisance that they were basically treated like unwanted roommates. You didn't get lice, you just had lice. Everyone did. Rich, poor, pious, drunk lice didn't discriminate. They were the true equalizers of medieval society. So what did people do? Well, for starters, they combed. Lice combs, often made of bone or wood, were common personal items, like a toothbrush is today, except instead of polishing teeth, you were raking bugs off your scalp, like some kind of tiny screaming orchard. These combs had fine, closely packed teeth designed to pull out the critters, their eggs, and most of your patience. Another method: boiling clothes or baking them near the fire. The heat could kill the lice, assuming you didn't earn your only tunic in the process. This is also why you might see medieval illustrations of people holding up their shirts near a flame. It wasn't a laundry day. It was pest execution. And then there was the classic technique of shaving one's head, particularly among monks or those who could get away with a bald look. Removing all hair was an effective, if traumatic, solution. Sometimes a wig was worn on top, which, ironically, could become its own lice hotel if not cleaned properly. Still, the logic was clear. No hair, no home for the vermin. Fleas were another problem, especially for those sleeping in straw mattresses or surrounded by animals. There weren't flea collars or bug sprays, only smoke, fumigation, and herbal sachets tossed between the sheets. Some believed certain smells repelled the pests. Others probably just hoped the fleas moved on to someone smellier. But the real solution was endurance. Everyone itched. Everyone scratched. It was part of life like taxes, death, or stepping in something unspeakable near the market stalls. Ah, the medieval toilet, a term that feels wildly optimistic. Because in truth, going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was less about comfort and more about creative improvisation and lowered expectations. Let's start with the elite. Castles had garderobes, which were basically closets with a hole in a stone bench that dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, and occasionally into an unfortunate patch of earth someone forgot to fence off. These were often located high up in towers for privacy and the added thrill of gravity. If you were below one, you learned quickly not to loiter. Peasants, on the other hand, had fewer luxuries. Most did their business outside in the woods, near the river, or behind the barn. Some villages had communal pits, essentially outhouses, with very low standards and even lower privacy. Your neighbor might be in there discussing crop yields mid-squat. For nighttime needs, chamber pots were the star of the show. These portable pots were tucked under beds or beside sleeping areas, ready to receive contributions in the dead of night. If you then never had the pleasure of relieving yourself into a cold ceramic bowl next to your sleeping family in the pitch-dark, congratulations. You're not medieval. And what did they do with the contents of said pots? They threw them out the window, literally, with a hearty shout of, "Guard as low! Watch out for the water!" Residents would dump their waste into the street below, ideally not hitting any passers-by. But let's face it, accuracy wasn't guaranteed. Street sanitation was handled mostly by gravity and pigs. Cities sometimes had gutters or central ditches to carry waste away, though these often clogged, overflowed, or just sat there fermenting into a neighborhood feature. Toilet paper? Not quite. People used rags, moss, straw, their hands, or, for the very refined, bits of wool or linen scraps. If that sounds unpleasant, imagine using snow in the winter, because they did. Before everyone collectively decided that bathing was suspicious and probably a sin, public bathhouses were actually thriving in medieval Europe. These weren't just tubs and soap. They were the social hotspots of their day. Think of them as medieval spas with a few extra plot twists. Bathhouses offered a variety of services: hot baths, steam rooms, massage, food, music, and depending on the establishment, the occasional questionable companionship. At their best, they were communal wellness centers. At their worst, they were bare-skinned dens of gossip, gluttony, and light scandal, and sometimes all three before noon. They were called stews, not because you sat in one too long, but because of the steamy water. Mixed-gender bathing wasn't unheard of, especially in places like Germany or Italy, where attitudes were a bit more relaxed. It wasn't always risk. Families could attend together. Monks sometimes bathed in pairs. But human nature being what it is, boundaries got murky, so did the water. Naturally, this made bathhouses a favorite target for the church. Clerics warned that bathing in mixed company led to sin, which, to be fair, it often did. Some bathhouses subtly became brothels with plumbing. The waters got hot, and not just from the fire beneath the tub. Then came the plagues, and everything changed. When diseases like the Black Death struck, bathhouses were blamed. Doctors believed open pores invited disease, and since warm baths opened pores well, the math added up in a we don't know about germs sort of way. Bathhouses shut down, reputations tanked, and suddenly the public bath was out permanently. Some regions held on to the tradition a bit longer. Southern Europe, the Middle East, and certain port cities kept their stews boiling for decades more. But in northern and central Europe, bathhouses began to vanish faster than your dignity after slipping into a communal tub. What remained was a mix of nostalgia and paranoia. Bathhouses had been warm, lively places, but they'd also become symbols of sin, disease, and damp decision-making. By the 1500s, the average person wasn't soaking with strangers anymore. They were dabbing at their armpits with vinegar and praying for the invention of soap that didn't smell like goat. Soap in the Middle Ages was a lot like medicine, at the time harsh, experimental, and likely to make you question your life choices. It technically worked, but using it felt more like punishment than self-care. The most common recipe? A hearty blend of animal fat and lye, or if you want to sound fancy, rendered tallow and wood ash. When combined, these ingredients created a substance that could strip dirt, oil, and possibly your soul from any surface. Early soap didn't come in pleasant pastel bars with ocean breeze scents. It came in coarse, waxy lumps that looked like something you'd avoid stepping in. To make it, you needed patience and a strong stomach. Boil down sheep or pig fat, stir in alkaline ash water, and wait while it hardened into blocks. If you added herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, you could convince yourself it was artisanal, but mostly, it just smelled like damp campfire and disappointment. Soap was mainly used for laundry and heavy-duty scrubbing, not so much for the body. At least not casually. Skin was considered delicate, and lye soap could turn a bath into a mild chemical burn. Still, people used it when necessary, especially before special events like weddings, court appearances, or plague outbreaks. More refined soaps came from the Islamic world and southern Europe, particularly Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil instead of animal fat and far gentler on the skin. These soaps were coveted luxury goods, traded across the Mediterranean and reserved for people who didn't already smell like goat on a daily basis. But for most folks, soap was a utility, not a pleasure. You used it to wash your linens, your dishes, maybe your hands, and only if they were really offensive. It wasn't part of a daily hygiene ritual. It was a monthly event, like taxes or a full moon. Some people went their whole lives with minimal soap exposure and considered themselves just fine, especially when surrounded by others doing exactly the same. Communal odor has a way of setting the bar low. In medieval Europe, doing the laundry wasn't just a chore. It was a full-body workout, a community event, and a flirtation with frostbite. Forget laundromats or washing machines. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to be willing to boil, beat, and beg the weather to cooperate. Most laundry was done in rivers, which sounds picturesque until you remember that these rivers also served as sewers, livestock baths, and the occasional body disposal site. But hey, running water is running water. First, you soaked your linens in lye or urine, yes, actual human urine collected in pots, and stored until it reached peak potency, known as chamber lye. It was valued for its ammonia content, which helped lift stains and whiten fabric. The smell, less helpful. But in a time when perfume was optional and hygiene was interpretive, it did the trick. After soaking, clothes were dragged to the river, scrubbed against wooden boards or large flat stones, and then pounded with paddles, a method known as fulling. It was less gentle wash and more clothes interrogation. This process could take hours and often involved the collective effort of washerwomen, who were both feared and admired for their arm strength. Then came the rinsing and the wringing and the drying, which, if it rained, meant waiting another day and hoping your shirt didn't develop new sentience. Clothes were often spread across bushes, hedges, or stretched on lines between trees and peasant huts. Medieval villages had the charming aesthetic of a never-ending yard sale. Of course, not everyone did their own laundry. Wealthy households had servants. Monasteries had lay brothers. And some towns even had professional washers. But for most people, it was DIY or nothing. Interestingly, clean clothes were more important than clean bodies. You might not have bathed in a month, but if your linen shift was bright and fresh-smelling, relatively speaking, you were considered presentable. In some cases, laundry was your hygiene. After 14 chapters of scratching, scrubbing, sniffing, and surviving, the question must finally be asked: did medieval hygiene actually work? Or was everyone just one unwashed tunic away from spontaneous combustion? The short answer: it worked well enough. Not by modern standards, of course. If you were to time travel back to 1347, your nostrils would probably file for divorce. But in their own context, medieval folks weren't completely oblivious to cleanliness. They simply operated on a different scale of what counted as clean. They had systems, even if those systems involved vinegar foot soaks and chamber pots hurled out windows. They had tools, lice combs, linen layers, vinegar, herbs, ash-based soap. They had rituals too, whether it was sponge bathing before Sunday Mass or boiling one as underwear on a full moon. Hygiene existed. It was just deeply interwoven with fear, faith, and the weather. In many ways, medieval people were doing the best they could with what they had, while also constantly trying not to anger God, the local baron, or their own armpits. The idea of regular full-body bathing was risky, time-consuming, and thanks to church doctrine and plague fears, seen as medically unwise. So they got inventive. And surprisingly, some practices aged well. Linen undergarments were hygienically smart. Herb-infused water and vinegar rinses pretty solid antibacterial logic. Even communal bathhouses were effective, until they turned into hot tubs of gossip and syphilis. But yes, people smelled. They scratched. They shared baths, lice, and deeply misinformed medical advice. Yet many lived to see old age, or at least a second harvest, despite the hygiene horrors. So while their standards were, let's say, fluid, they weren't without effort. Hygiene was more of a social signal than a science. Clean clothes equaled virtue. Shiny hair, or at least less itchy hair, meant discipline. And avoiding full-body rot was just good manners. In the end, medieval hygiene worked in the same way that balancing a wagon wheel with twine works barely, but impressively, considering the tools. Imagine walking through a city over 4,000 years ago, the ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you were expecting dusty huts and random alleyways, think again. This place was so well planned, it could make a modern city planner weep with envy. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro wasn't thrown together like a festival campsite. It was meticulously organized. The city was laid out in a grid pattern, yes, actual blocks and right angles. Streets ran north to south and east to west, intersecting cleanly and forming a neat network of roads. It was as if the architects used a ruler and said, "Let's keep this geometric." But the real magic wasn't just on the surface. Underneath those dusty roads was a system that even 21st century cities often fail to maintain: drainage. Mohenjo-Daro had an underground sewer system. Almost every house, no matter how small, had access to water and drainage. Wastewater flowed from homes into covered drains running alongside the streets. You could almost hear the ancient residents saying, "Yes, actually, sanitation matters." The city wasn't just a giant bathroom with bricks, though. It was zoned with intention. There was a citadel on a raised mound, probably home to administrative or religious elites, and a lower city where the general population lived. Public buildings like the famed Great Bath suggest that this wasn't just about survival. There was ritual, maybe even recreation, soaked into the clay bricks. Markets likely thrived along the main streets, and houses varied in size, indicating social stratification. But even the modest homes had private wells and toilets. Let that sink in. People with fewer means still had indoor plumbing 4 millennia ago. Meanwhile, Many 19th century Europeans were still throwing waste out of windows. And then mystery. The city was eventually abandoned. No sign of conquest. No dramatic fire. Just silence. Perhaps climate shifts. Perhaps trade disruption. But whatever the cause, the legacy of Mohenjo-daro endures, a city built with intent, intelligence, and a disturbing awareness that clean water and zoning laws actually matter. And they didn't even have an urban planning department. Go figure. If Mohenjo-daro was the tidy accountant of ancient cities, Babylon was the theatrical celebrity. Flashy, vast, and drenched in myth, Babylon wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. It rose and fell many times over the centuries, but in its prime around the 6th century BCE, under Nebuchadnezzar II Babylon, was the glittering heart of Mesopotamia. Now, don't let the poetry fool you. This place was as carefully planned as it was majestic. Babylon was a walled city with massive gates, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate, adorned with dazzling blue tiles and sacred lions that looked like they belonged in a dream sequence. And no, it wasn't just decorative. The gate was part of a carefully orchestrated urban layout. At the center of Babylon's design was a sacred axis, a processional way that ran straight through the city. This wasn't just a road, it was a parade route for gods. Literally. Religious festivals like the Akichu New Year Festival would process along this street, linking the great Edamananki ziggurat, which may or may not have inspired this story of the Tower of Babel, to the mighty temple dedicated to the god Marduk. Urban planning here was part piety, part propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon. You walked its holy narrative every day. Babylon's streets curved with the river and obeyed the land's contours, but they were also zoned smartly. There were residential quarters, temple complexes, gardens, markets, and administrative centers. The Euphrates River sliced through the city, providing not only water, but also a navigable artery for trade, commerce, and, let's be honest, showing off. Drainage systems were present, though not quite as refined as in the Indus Valley. Still, homes had bathrooms with clay pipes and canals to move wastewater away. Babylonian engineers were clearly not amateurs. Even bricks bore inscriptions of the king's name, because if you're going to build sewers, you might as well brand them. Babylon was a city designed to impress both mortals and gods. Every street, every gate, every temple was a statement: look upon my works, ye mighty, and marvel at the zoning permits. And people did. Even Alexander the Great reportedly planned to make Babylon his capital, because once you've walked down a street made for a god, Athens probably felt a bit underwhelming. Roughly 1,000 years before the Aztecs marveled at its ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, this ancient Mexican city was already flexing its urban design skills. Let's return to Mohenjo-daro, our sanitation superstar. Nearly every house, regardless of size, had its own private bathing area, complete with a sloped floor to drain water. Wastewater was channeled into covered street drains, yes, covered drains lined with bricks and equipped with access holes for cleaning. The drains ran along nearly every street, carrying waste away from the city. It was basically an early version of municipal plumbing. This was not just clever, it was revolutionary. Compare that to Babylon, where hygiene was more symbolic. The city had canals and some drainage channels, and clay pipes carried water into palaces and temples. But for the average citizen, sanitation involved cesspits, open ditches, and divine forgiveness. Still, bathrooms were common, and wealthier homes had indoor plumbing using clay piping. Some records even describe a rudimentary flushing system, likely involving buckets and good timing. Now let's zoom into Teotihuacan. Though not as obsessed with drainage as the Indus Valley, Teotihuacan still featured carefully engineered stormwater canals and separate sewage systems in elite compounds. Many residential complexes had internal drains, and public buildings often had designated latrines. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, It was likely tied to religious purity, especially in ritual areas like temples or the Avenue of the Dead. Even smaller cities in the ancient world, like Lawful and Harappa, reflect a deep understanding of hydrology, with wells, reservoirs, and strategically sloped streets to prevent flooding. Imagine planning an entire town with gravity and seasonal monsoons in mind, and then pulling it off in 2400 BCE. What makes all of this impressive isn't just the tech, it's the mindset. These civilizations viewed water not just as a necessity, but as something to be channeled, shared, and respected. Hygiene wasn't a luxury for the elite. It was embedded in the urban design itself. Modern cities still struggle with waste management. These ancients, they were already digging trenches and laying bricks, quietly reminding us that flushing is a civilizational achievement. If temples were where ancient people spoke to the gods, markets were where they negotiated with each other, and likely argued over the price of onions. Every ancient city we've explored so far had a beating economic heart, and that heart pulsed in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, trade routes, and economic zoning. In Babylon, markets were not a chaotic afterthought squeezed between temples. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban grid, and regulated by law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal texts, devotes dozens of clauses to trade practices, weights, measures, and merchant behavior. Markets bustled with activity under porticos and open-air squares. Grains, textiles, wine, slaves, and livestock changed hands, while scribes tracked debts and transactions. This wasn't just shopping, it was commerce with legal infrastructure. Now shift to Teotihuacan, where things get even more fascinating. The city hosted enormous market plazas, especially near the Ciudadela complex, where thousands gathered to trade obsidian tools, cacao, feathers, ceramics, and salt. Unlike the highly centralized temple economies of some cultures, Teotihuacan's market system appeared decentralized and community-driven, with different neighborhoods specializing in specific crafts. Think of it as an ancient version of local Etsy shops, except your supplier lived in the next compound. Meanwhile, in Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus zones with wide avenues and adjacent warehouses, archaeologists have uncovered standardized weights and scales, suggesting a robust system of regulation. Goods from as far away as Mesopotamia, including seals and precious stones, have been found in Indus sites, indicating that international trade was a thing. Imagine your neighborhood fishmonger accepting Mesopotamian currency and not even blinking. But it wasn't just about money. Markets were social hubs. In Babylon, they were places to catch gossip, settle disputes, and see who was wearing the latest Assyrian tunic. In Teotihuacan, they were multicultural melting pots, with traders and travelers from distant lands mingling among pyramids. Even the Indus cities, which lacked grand palaces or temples, prioritized economic zones in their design. Trade drove innovation. It demanded roads, regulation, and records. And ancient urban planners responded not with chaos, but with structure. Behind every sacred temple or fortress wall, there was a merchant yelling, "Best price in the city." In the ancient world, urban planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts. It was about the gods. Temples weren't hidden in quiet corners. They dominated skylines, sat atop the city's highest points, and demanded prime real estate. If markets were the city's heartbeat, temples were its soul, and ancient planners made sure everyone knew it. Start with Babylon. The skyline was pierced by the Etemenanke ziggurat, a multi-tiered mountain of baked brick dedicated to the god Marduk. It was no modest shrine. It was an architectural flex, measuring around 91 meters high if ancient sources are to be believed. It was meant to bridge heaven and earth. And this wasn't just spiritual. It was centralized urban messaging. Roads led to the temple, ceremonies revolved around it, and the entire city bowed architecturally and ritually to its divine core. Teotihuacan, too, placed its spiritual heart front and center. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon weren't just ceremonial structures. They were urban anchors. The Avenue of the Dead connected these temples like a celestial path, aligning with astronomical events and possibly even solstices. Everything from residential compounds to market spaces seemed to radiate out from these temples. They weren't background props. They were cosmic coordinates, guiding both foot traffic and philosophy. And then there's Mohenjo-daro, which didn't have towering ziggurats or pyramids, but instead gave us the Great Bathy large public water tank, likely used for ritual purification. This wasn't just a swimming hole. It was engineered with watertight bricks, a sophisticated drain system, and possibly linked to spiritual practices of cleanliness and rebirth. No idol-lined sanctuaries here, just water, geometry, and silence. In all these cities, sacred spaces were deliberately placed and functionally integrated. The temples weren't isolated. They were connected to processional roads, public courtyards, and administrative centers. Worship wasn't separate from life. It was life. Urban planning reflected this unity. These were not secular societies with temples. They were sacred landscapes disguised as cities. Every brick laid, every street carved, every plaza placed was part of a larger spiritual choreography. Because in the ancient world, to build a city was to make an offering, and the gods always got the best seat in the house. It's tempting to think of modern cities as products of innovation, blueprints, and civil engineering degrees. But dig a little deeper literally, and you will find that the bones of urban life were laid thousands of years ago by planners without concrete, bulldozers, or CAD software. The DNA of city planning grids, zoning, sanitation, civic centers, religious spaces was already etched into the earth by people we often underestimate. Take drainage. Mohenjo-daro didn't just throw down a few ditches. They designed an integrated multi-level wastewater system that ran through homes and beneath streets. The concept of universal access to sanitation, still elusive in parts of the modern world, was a standard in this Bronze Age metropolis. Babylon laid the groundwork for regulated commerce, civic infrastructure, and the symbolic use of space to reinforce power and religion. Teotihuacan gave us the template of the cosmic City One, where every road, plaza, and temple pointed to something bigger than the human eye could see. Its builders connected astronomy to architecture, embedding celestial rhythms into everyday movement. These weren't just settlements, they were philosophical blueprints. And then there's the psychological aspect. Ancient cities influenced behavior-wide avenues, allowed for processions and parades, while enclosed courtyards created communal spaces. Zoning wasn't just practical. It shaped how people interacted, how neighborhoods formed, and how authority was visualized. These choices told people where to gather, what was sacred, and how to live in harmony or at least try. Modern urban planning owes much to this ancient foresight. Grids in Manhattan, sanitation in Amsterdam, temples turned into cathedrals, then into town halls. Even the idea of a civic center comes from these ancestral cityscapes. We still measure property. We still design cities around access, trade, spirituality, and spectacle. What's changed is the technology, not the principle. And while we pave highways and erect skyscrapers, the core remains. Cities are stories we write in stone, brick, and steel. And the first chapters of that story, they were carved with copper tools, planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space, you're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet. Hadrian was not born in the heart of Rome, but on its distant western fringe. He came into the world in 76 CE in Italica, a Romanized town in the province of Hispania Baetica, modern-day southern Spain. Though geographically far from the capital, Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. They were wealthy, elite, and thoroughly Roman in culture and ambition. Most importantly, his father's side was related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Traianus, the man who would later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both of his parents around the age of 10, a deep and defining tragedy that shaped his future. He came under the guardianship of Trajan and Publius Acilius Attianus, a Roman knight who would remain a crucial presence in his life. While many noble boys were pushed toward military or political ambition, Hadrian's curiosity was drawn to Greek literature, philosophy, and art. He spoke Greek fluently, read Homer with obsessive devotion, and found more comfort in scrolls than in swords, at least in his youth. Still, Rome did not run on poetry, and Hadrian, like all men of status, had to earn his place through service. He began his public life as a military tribune, serving first in Lower Moesia, then in Upper Moesia, and finally in Pannonia. Though capable in command, his mind shone brighter in governance than in battle. Trajan's rise to emperor in 98 CE became a turning point in Hadrian's life. Though their relationship often bristled, Hadrian's intellect could seem aloof, and a sharp-tongued grated Trajan kept him close. Hadrian moved steadily through Rome's cursus honorum, serving as quaestor, tribune of the plebs, and eventually praetor. His marriage to Vibia Sabina, Trajan's grandniece, was politically astute but personally distant. Their union lacked warmth, and Hadrian increasingly found solace in philosophical companionship and the company of men, most notably his future beloved, Antinous. His early years were marked by the tug-of-war between Roman duty and Hellenic soul. A soldier by necessity, a philosopher at heart. In 117 CE, Emperor Trajan grew gravely ill during a campaign in the east. The issue of succession loomed large and uncertain. Though Hadrian had long worked in the shadow of the imperial family, Trajan never publicly named him heir. When Trajan died in Selinus, far from Rome, a letter promptly arrived stating Hadrian had been adopted on the emperor's deathbed. Witnessed by Trajan's wife Plotina and the ever-loyal Attianus, the adoption was convenient, perhaps too convenient. Whispers of forgery spread, and many in the Senate questioned its legitimacy. Some believed Plotina orchestrated the act to ensure a stable transition. Yet despite doubts, the Senate confirmed Hadrian as emperor on August 11th, 117 CE. His reign, however, began in turbulence. Trajan had stretched Rome's borders too far, and the eastern front simmered with rebellion. Hadrian made the controversial decision to abandon these hard-won territories in Mesopotamia and Armenia. Though strategically sound, the move was deeply unpopular, especially among generals and senators who had fought for those gains. Resentment grew. Not long after, 4 senators who had opposed Hadrian's accession were executed. The charges were vague, and Hadrian disavowed any involvement, placing blame on Attianus. Still, the stain of political blood clung to him. His philosophical demeanor could not mask the steel beneath. When challenged, Hadrian acted decisively, even ruthlessly. Yet in the midst of discord, his vision emerged. He forgave debts, distributed money to the poor, and secured the army's loyalty. But most of all, he shifted Rome's priorities. Instead of chasing new wars, Hadrian turned inward toward stability, toward architecture, and toward uniting a vast empire through presence rather than conquest. Hadrian did not wish to sit idly in marble halls. He envisioned an emperor not above the provinces, but among them. So, he embarked on an odyssey of presence, setting foot in almost every region under his rule. His first great journey began in 121 CE and would last for years. He crossed Gaul and Germania, visited the windswept reaches of Britannia, traversed Hispania, journeyed into Africa, and wandered the sacred paths of Greece and the sunlit coasts of Asia Minor. In Britannia, faced with the chaos beyond Rome's northern frontier, he made a profound decision not to advance, but to defend. Hadrian's Wall became both a literal and symbolic line, defining not just borders, but Rome's new posture: secure, restrained, and lasting. In Africa, he focused on roads and fortresses. In Egypt, he was honored as a living god and nearly drowned in the Nile. But his heart always returned to Greece. There he wasn't just emperor. He was a student, a patron, a kindred spirit. He funded temples, revived forgotten leagues, and immersed himself in the Eleusinian mysteries. Far from the cynicism of politics, Greece gave him refuge and inspiration. His travels were never idle. Every step Hadrian took, every handshake, every cornerstone laid, stitched the empire together, not with fear, but with recognition. His was a rule of architecture, both physical and symbolic. And architecture became his true language. Hadrian built with a deliberate hand and an idealistic mind. He believed that structures could reflect harmony, order, and unity. Temples, aqueducts, arches, and libraries blossomed across the empire, each a quiet proclamation of Rome's strength and Hadrian's vision. Among his most lasting gifts to the capital was the rebuilt Pantheon. With its perfect dome and central oculus, it summoned the cosmos into a temple, a structure of mathematics and mystery, of form and divinity. A monument not just to gods, but to the human spirit's reach. Then there was Villa Adriana in Tivoli, a sprawling palace villa east of Rome. It wasn't merely luxurious, it was encyclopedic. A dreamscape of Hadrian's favorite places, from Egyptian halls to Greek peristyles, layered with symbolism and serenity. It was less a palace than a living philosophy, where one could wander from a temple to a reflecting pool to a conversation under painted colonnades. It was here that Hadrian could be fully himself: emperor, architect, philosopher, and man. Though his reign was not without tragedy and tenuous, death on the Nile shattered him. It was also one of profound reimagination. Rome did not shrink under Hadrian. It settled, matured, deepened. He did not need to conquer the world to leave a mark. He built instead, and in doing so, he gave shape to a quieter empire defined, not by expansion, but by elegance. And the first chapters of that story, they were carved with copper tools, planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space, you're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet, that became both retreat and laboratory. Unlike typical imperial villas, Hadrian's estate was a curated architectural portfolio of an empire distilled into stone. It replicated the splendor of distant provinces, Egyptian colonnades, Greek stoas, even a canal that mimicked the languid sweep of the Nile. This wasn't merely a residence, it was a dreamscape built by a philosopher king, an architectural testament that Rome didn't just rule the world, it contained it. Across the provinces, he launched ambitious infrastructure campaigns. In Athens, he completed the Temple of Olympian Zeus, a massive project left unfinished for centuries. In North Africa, he laid roads, funded aqueducts, and built granaries. In Asia Minor and the Levant, he helped restore cities leveled by earthquakes. Yet in Jerusalem, his decision to refound the city as Aelia Capitolina ignited controversy, especially among the Jewish population. And this act would have consequences that would echo violently through history. Hadrian's architectural language mirrored his travels. He embraced the arch and the dome, symmetry and structure, but he also welcomed local styles. Greek elegance, Egyptian symbolism, regional stones, all were interwoven into his imperial designs. Rather than impose Roman identity, he allowed Rome to absorb and celebrate diversity. To Hadrian, architecture was more than function or form. It was philosophy in mortar, the embodiment of ideas in brick. It whispered not conquest, but cohesion. Through his buildings, he declared, Rome is not a place, it is a concept. And this is what it looks like. Among all the people who accompanied Hadrian in his journeys, None would shape his soul more profoundly than Antinous, a beautiful youth from Bithynia in Asia Minor. Their relationship, whispered about in ancient texts, both deeply tender and sharply controversial, would become one of the most emotionally charged bonds in imperial history. Antinous entered Hadrian's life around 124 CE, likely as a teenage companion. Described in near-mythical terms calm, strikingly handsome, and endlessly gentle, Antinous soon became Hadrian's constant companion. Together, they traversed the empire, with their bond deepening in the quiet moments between temples, libraries, and rivers. The nature of their relationship was never formally declared, but in the halls of power and in the hush of streets, it was understood to be a love profound and rare. But in 130 CE, as they sailed the Nile, tragedy struck. Antinous drowned. How or why remains a mystery. Some whispered of ritual sacrifice, others of fate, and still others of despair. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. Hadrian was undone. His grief was not hidden behind marble or muted by etiquette. It poured forth openly, staining statues with tears. What followed was unprecedented. Hadrian deified Antinous. He built a city, Antinopolis, near the site of his death. He commissioned statues by the hundreds. He established temples and festivals. Coins were minted in Antinous' image. He became a new kind of god, young, serene, eternally beautiful. To the Roman people, he became a symbol of youth and rebirth. To Hadrian, he was something more, a personal divinity, a love immortalized in marble and mythology. Never before had an emperor honored a companion this way, and through Antinous, Hadrian rewrote the boundaries between mortal and divine. Long after Hadrian's own ashes settled, Antinous' likeness would remain gazing softly from pedestals across the empire, his memory cradled in stone. But Hadrian's reign, rich in philosophy and art, was not free of fire. One of its most searing chapters unfolded in Judea with the Bar Kokhba revolt, the most devastating Jewish uprising against Rome. The seeds of rebellion were sown with Hadrian's attempt to reshape Jerusalem into a Roman colony. Aelia Capitolina, named in his honor and dedicated to Jupiter. Plans to erect a temple over the ruins of the Second Temple were perceived as an unspeakable violation. To many Jews, it was not reform but erasure. In 132 CE, resistance erupted. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic and fiery leader hailed by some as the Messiah, the revolt caught Rome off guard. Bar Kokhba's forces seized Jerusalem and declared an independent state, striking coins and enforcing Jewish law. Hadrian responded not with words, but with legions. He recalled Julius Severus, one of Rome's fiercest generals, and unleashed a campaign of grim, methodical retaliation. Village by village, the Roman army crushed resistance, burning fields, executing suspected rebels, and leaving no shelter untouched. The rebellion raged for years. By 135 CE, it was extinguished in blood. Bar Kokhba was dead. Over 500,000 Jews were said to have perished. Countless others were sold into slavery. Judea was no longer Judea. It was renamed Syria Palestina, a calculated blow meant to erase the Jewish presence from memory and map. Religious practices were restricted. The survivors scattered. Hadrian, who once stood as a patron of temples and cities, had shown another face, the ruthless commander cloaked in Roman pragmatism. In the ashes of rebellion, one saw not the builder, but the enforcer. In the years that followed, the philosopher king grew weary. His health declined. The restless traveler now sat still. Illness crept in, likely heart disease or kidney failure. His body swelled. His breath came in gasps. The man who had paced colonnades and crossed empires in sandals now stayed within his villa's quiet courtyards. His mind, once filled with the geometry of domes and verses of Homer, turned inward. He began to write poetry not of glory, but of mortality. One fragment remains, a whisper to his soul. animula vagula blandula, a farewell both intimate and universal. Even in illness, Hadrian thought as a poet, a builder of feelings as well as cities. With no children of his own, he faced the final question: who would succeed him? His first choice was Lucius Aelius Caesar, a polished senator with charm, but poor health. Many doubted the appointment, and they were right. Lucius died not long after his adoption, perhaps from tuberculosis. Crushed and rushed, Hadrian made another choice. In 138 CE, he adopted Antoninus Pius, a man of moderation and integrity. But there was a condition. Antoninus must adopt young Marcus Annius Verus, later known as Marcus Aurelius. In this act, Hadrian shaped not just his succession, but Rome's future, securing 2 generations of thoughtful, stable emperors. Still, this planning did little to comfort his fading spirit. He withdrew to Villa Adriana, surrounded by sculpture, memory, and the silent echoes of Antinous. His final days were darkened by despair. He tried, more than once, to take his own life, but attendants intervened. And then, in July 138 CE, Hadrian's long journey ended. He died at 62, his ashes placed in the mausoleum he had built for himself, a monument to a life lived in lines, in pillars, and in love. And the first chapters of that story, they were carved with copper tools, planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space, you're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet. In an age that worshipped expansion, Hadrian had the clarity and the courage to turn inward. The echoes of that decision still resonate today. Hadrian's Wall, stretching stoically across the northern wilds of Britain, stood not as a sign of endless conquest, but of thoughtful restraint. It whispered, "This is Rome, and that is not." It was more than defense, it was philosophy made stone. In the heart of the capital, his reconstruction of the Pantheon shifted the arc of architectural history. Its soaring concrete dome, still the largest unreinforced of its kind, was a temple not only to gods, but to human imagination. It was an embodiment of Hadrian himself, measured, daring, timeless. His villa at Tivoli, with water gardens and sunlit porticos, would later inspire Renaissance palaces, its design echoing through centuries. But Hadrian's legacy was etched not only in marble. He reshaped Roman law, refined provincial administration, and led not by distant delegation, but by presence. He walked where others ruled. He listened. He learned. His Rome was not only one of might and muscle, but of mind and memory. He didn't merely rule the empire. He reframed the very idea of what it meant to lead. His reign was a fulcrum between eras, a hinge between warrior kings and philosopher-statesmen. Unlike his forebears, Hadrian projected strength not through fear, but through visibility. He crossed mountains and deserts to see with his own eyes, to greet governors, to inspect aqueducts, to converse with scholars. In doing so, he redefined power itself. His successors Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius continued that legacy, leaning not into conquest, but into contemplation, fairness, and governance. It is possible that without Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius might never have taken pen to parchment and whispered philosophical meditations into the night. Hadrian legitimized thought as an imperial virtue, but his reign, serene on the surface, held deep tensions. Behind the graceful columns lay quiet ruthlessness, the executions of dissenting senators, the suffocating force used in Judea, the hidden costs of cohesion. He was a man who preached moderation, yet ruled with precision and force when threatened. Privately, he wrestled with mortality, composing verses on life's fragility. His footsteps, still faintly imprinted across provinces, tell the tale of a ruler who stitched together an empire not with fire, but with form and feeling. Hadrian's greatness was never about what he took, but what he preserved, built, and envisioned. He was a paradox crowned in laurels, architect and autocrat, poet and emperor, human and enigma. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet. They were mistaken. The Columbia was no gentle stream. It was a roaring force of nature. Rapids tore through narrow canyons. Winds whipped through the gorges, and the water churned with hidden rocks and whirlpools. The canoes, hastily carved from logs, bucked and lurched like frightened animals. Still, they pressed on. The Pacific was tantalizingly close, and despite aching limbs, tattered clothes, and gnawing hunger, the men's spirits lifted with each mile westward. As October deepened, the landscape transformed again. Towering evergreens cloaked the riverbanks, and the air grew damp with coastal fog. Game returned elk, waterfowl, and salmon, reviving the weary party. Yet the river remained treacherous. Several near drownings reminded them how fragile progress could be, but still they endured, powered by grit, guidance from local tribes, and the quiet leadership of both Lewis and Clark. Then, in mid-November 1805, a distant roar met their ears, the sound of waves crashing on the shore. Cresting the final bluff, they saw it at last. The Pacific Ocean, vast, gray, and brimming with salt spray. The moment was monumental. What had begun as Jefferson's bold question had now become an answer written in river mud, frostbite, and determination. The Corps had traveled over 4,000 miles through uncharted wilderness. They had mapped mountains, crossed tribal nations, and proven the breadth of the American continent. But they had also learned that the land they traversed was already ancient, alive, and interconnected by people, stories, and systems long before the stars and stripes arrived. At the coast, they built Fort Clatsop near present-day Astoria, Oregon, to survive one last winter. The fort was cramped and sodden, pounded by relentless rain and shrouded in mist. Food was scarce, spirits flagged, and the long wait for spring tested every man. Still, the journals filled. New plants were pressed, new animals described, and new languages recorded. Sacagawea continued to guide and interpret, while York, the only black member of the Corps, astonished native observers who had never seen a man like him. Both were unofficial members, but indispensable. When winter finally broke, they turned east. The return journey, while faster, was no less demanding. Rivers swelled with spring runoff, and tensions flared within the group. Lewis and Clark even briefly split up to explore different routes. But by September 1806, over 2 years after they had set out, the Corps of Discovery returned to St. Louis exhausted, thinner, but triumphant. They had not found a navigable waterway to the Pacific, but they had discovered something deeper, the sprawling complexity of a continent and the fragile interdependence between ambition and survival. Jefferson's gamble had paid off, not in gold or immediate glory, but in knowledge. The maps, specimens, and journals brought back by Lewis and Clark would expand not just America's borders, but its sense of possibility. And the story they left behind would become legend. A tale of resilience, curiosity, and the quiet bravery of those who dared to enter the unknown. And the first chapters of that story, they were carved with copper tools, planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of ideas quietly whispering beneath your feet. They were in for a wet, violent surprise. The Columbia was no lazy river. It was fast, rocky, and moody, and at times seemed to fight their very existence. The canoes were heavy and often unstable, especially under the full weight of gear, journals, specimens, and human exhaustion. Treacherous rapids threatened to flip boats and drown precious cargo. More than once, men nearly died. Only quick reflexes and sheer luck kept the expedition from losing everything. Along the way, they encountered several Chinookan and Sahaptin-speaking tribes, whose societies were rich in trade, especially in salmon, a staple food that swam in impossible abundance. The Corps marveled at the intricate fishing methods, carved plank houses, and sleek canoes. These tribes were experienced and observant, welcoming at times, but often cautious. Diplomacy was never guaranteed. Some saw the strangers as guests. Others saw them as intruders. The farther west they traveled, the more the environment transformed. Rain fell with merciless regularity. The lush forests of what is now Washington and Oregon were beautiful, but cold, damp, and relentless. Clothing molded. Gunpowder became unreliable. The journals of Lewis and Clark during this period read like diaries from a soggy purgatory. Finally, in mid-November 1805, after 18 months of hardship, the Corps reached the mouth of the Columbia River. Through gray, stormy mist, they glimpsed the Pacific Ocean for the first time. The moment should have been triumphant, but it was anything but romantic. Their camp, hastily constructed near present-day Astoria, Oregon, was a muddy mess of wind and despair. They named the site Fort Clatsop and would spend a long, wet winter there, cold, sick, and plagued by fleas. They spent their days making moccasins, oiling elk meat, and writing page after page of journals. They had made it, but now the hardest truth stared them down. They still had to go back. Reaching the Pacific Ocean in November 1805 should have marked a victory lap, but the ocean was not in a festive mood. Torrential rain, freezing temperatures, and relentless coastal storms turned their long-awaited reward into a damp, muddy trial. With little choice, the expedition built a crude shelter on the south side of the Columbia River, naming it Fort Clatsop after the local Clatsop tribe. The winter of 1805 to 1806 was brutal. It rained nearly every day. Clark counted only 12 without it. The men's clothing rotted. Lice and fleas spread. Scurvy loomed. Their primary food source, elk, had to be hunted daily, often miles from camp. The meat was tough, lean, and barely enough to sustain morale, let alone strength. Despite the discomfort, Lewis and Clark insisted on continued documentation. They recorded tribal customs, geography, plants, animals, and weather patterns, adding hundreds of pages to the scientific record. Lewis described sea otters in detail. Clark refined the maps that would guide future settlers. Even in misery, they remained disciplined observers. Interactions with local tribes were mixed. The Clatsop and Chinook were seasoned traders with long-standing coastal networks. They were polite, but not especially welcoming. Negotiations for food or supplies were businesslike, not generous. Unlike the Mandan or Nez Perce, these coastal communities expected fair value, and they showed impatience when the Americans' trade goods failed to impress. And then there was the boredom. Trapped in a sodden fort, waiting for the weather to break, the men passed the time making salt, mending clothes, and carving wooden souvenirs. Spirits waned. Illness spread. Even Lewis, normally composed, became irritable and withdrawn. By March 1806, the Corps had had enough. With their journals overflowing, samples preserved, and bodies stiff from months of damp hardship, they burned their last candles at Fort Clatsop, packed what little hadn't rotted, and turned eastward. They had found the Pacific. Now came the real test, surviving the long return without the awe of the unknown, only the memory of every painful step ahead. On March 23, 1806, the Corps of Discovery left Fort Clatsop with soaked clothing, exhausted bodies, and a singular goal: get home. They had accomplished what no other Americans had, reaching the Pacific overland, but the journey back would prove just as perilous. The wilderness they once entered with curiosity now loomed with a different energy, familiar but still unforgiving. They retraced their steps up the Columbia River, again battling high currents and steep cliffs. Their interactions with coastal tribes grew more tense. The Chinook and others seemed increasingly guarded, perhaps sensing the deeper changes these Americans represented. By late spring, they crossed the Bitterroot Mountains again. The weather was better, their planning more careful, and the Nez Perce faithful to their word welcomed them warmly, returning their horses and helping them prepare for the plains. Then, Lewis and Clark made a bold decision. To gather more knowledge, they split into two groups. Lewis went north toward the Marias River, hoping to chart its connection to the Missouri and assert use claims. Clark followed the Yellowstone River, mapping its course and seeking better overland routes. But splitting the party was risky. There was no way to communicate between groups. Lewis's path turned dangerous. In late July, his party encountered a group of Blackfeet warriors. The initial meeting seemed cordial, but tensions escalated when the Blackfeet noticed the Americans' firearms and trade goods. That night, conflict erupted. In the scuffle, 2 Blackfeet men were killed, the only hostile fatalities of the entire expedition. Lewis and his men fled under cover of darkness, shaken and injured. Clark's group fared better. They navigated the Yellowstone, suffered a bison stampede, and reunited with Sacagawea and her family. By August 1806, the 2 groups met again along the Missouri River. The expedition was whole once more, but the mood had shifted. The thrill of exploration had faded. Only the long paddle home remained. By late August, the Missouri River pulled the Corps downstream, not toward mystery, but toward memory. They were thinner now, their uniforms in tatters, their journals swollen with mud-streaked pages, but they were alive. On September 23, 1806, the expedition returned to St. Louis. No parades, just stunned faces. Many had presumed them dead. In just over 2 years, they had traveled more than 8,000 miles, met over 50 native nations, documented hundreds of species, and mapped large swaths of a continent. They had planted a flag literally and symbolically across a wilderness long inhabited by others. They were hailed as heroes. Newspapers celebrated them. Jefferson was elated, but their lives after the journey told a more complex story. Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, but plagued by depression, debt, and alcoholism. He died just 3 years later, possibly by suicide, possibly by murder alone on the Natchez Trace. His death cast a shadow over the mission he once led with such brilliance. William Clark, by contrast, thrived. He became governor of Missouri Territory, oversaw Indian affairs, and remained a powerful figure in Western expansion. He named his first son Meriwether Lewis Clark, a tribute to his fallen partner. And what of Sacagawea and York? Sacagawea returned west with her husband and child. Her fate is debated, but her legacy grew. York, the enslaved man who had impressed so many along the journey, remained unfreed for years. Clark's refusal was a bitter stain on a story of supposed progress. The legacy of the expedition is vast and complicated. It opened the West for America, but it also opened the door for displacement, colonization, and irreversible change. Lewis and Clark's journey was not just one of maps and mountains. It was a story of ambition and resilience, but also of cultural collision and the cost of empire. And the first chapters of that story, they were carved with copper tools, planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of ideas quietly whispering beneath your feet.